I don't know about you, but I need to be around people who have just come to know Christ, whose hearts are on fire for Jesus, who love the Lord with all of their heart. I met a man in the former Soviet Union. I've talked about him before, by the name of Vladimir. Vladimir grew up as an atheist in the former Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, he turned to Christ and God changed his life. He was a lawyer and he was on fire for Jesus, and he traveled with me so many times, and we would go to places and preach the gospel and he would translate for me, and oh, what a friendship was birthed in my life. And he would want me to disciple him and I would disciple him, but he would put a flame in my heart. There was that simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ, and that's what Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. He said, I'm afraid. He had a concern for them. He said, I'm afraid that you will lose that simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. And he was calling them to make sure they kept that simple, pure devotion, love for Christ, and faith in Him. And it was so important. And Vladimir taught me that. Let me tell you, one time we were going from Moldova to Norilsk, which is in the Arctic Circle, and we were going there to hold an evangelistic event. And we had to fly through Moscow, and when we got to Moscow, they came on and said, your flight has been delayed for 3 hours. Well, it was delayed another 3 hours and another 3 hours. We waited in the Moscow airport for 3 days and 3 nights. We were stuck. There was a fuel shortage, and everyone was stuck at that time. But that was no problem for Vladimir. For you see, Vladimir said, Sammy, I know what we can do. I said, what's that, Vladimir? He said, we can hold our evangelistic meeting here. We can't get to Siberia, so let's do it here. I said, Vladimir, they would never let us do that. He said, oh, Sammy, we just need to trust God. He'll open the door. I said, well, how would we do it? He said, just come with me. He found a crowd of people. He walked and he just went, okay, Sammy, preach. I said, Vladimir, you didn't get anyone's attention. He said, preach. And I started preaching and he started interpreting. I shared my testimony. I shared the gospel. And I looked and people were weeping. Tears were running down their cheek. And I gave an invitation and people came to Christ, gave their hearts to Jesus. We finished there and he said, Sammy, let's go find another spot. We went to another part of the airport. We did the same thing there, and people came to Christ. For 3 days, we preached the gospel in the Moscow airport, and God moved and God worked. Well, finally, we got our flight to Siberia. We were 3 days late, but we got there. And when we arrived, there was a big snowstorm, and we couldn't get from the airport to the city because the airport was on the outside of the city. No problem for Vladimir. Vladimir started sharing Jesus with everyone in that airport. And then he came to me and he said, Sammy, I've got good news. I said, what's that, Vladimir? He said, I talked to the director of operations for the airport and we have a helicopter coming. Sure enough, a helicopter comes and lands, and about 20 people plus us got on that big military helicopter, and we got in there. And when they closed the door, Vladimir looked at me and this is what he said. He said, Sammy, it's time to preach. I said, Vladimir, he said, preach it, Sammy. So I started preaching as we flew into the city, and I shared the gospel with all of those and prayed with them before we landed. Oh, I tell you what, Vladimir had a simple, pure devotion to Jesus Christ. Oh, he had just met Christ and he wanted everyone to know what God had done for him. I needed Vladimir. Vladimir said, Sammy, disciple me, disciple me. I needed Vladimir. I needed that fresh fire in my heart. I needed that simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. Oh, let me ask you, have you left your first love? Have you lost that simplicity of faith, that simplicity of devotion to Christ? Return today to your first love and to that simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ.